We're going to ask Congressman Barry Moore, Alabama, to lead in the Pledge of Allegiance.
To the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Representative Moore. Without objection, Chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. Everyone, we welcome you to today's hearing on the fentanyl crisis in America. I will now recognize myself for an opening statement. You got mine. Thank you. I thank the members and witnesses for coming today. As you know, this is the first hearing of this subcommittee, this Congress, and I welcome our new and returning members. The business before us today is this hearing, which is entitled "The Fentanyl Crisis in America, Inaction is No Longer an Option." I hope my colleagues will agree that inaction is truly no longer an option concerning this crisis. The first wave of opioid deaths began in the late 1990s with an increase in overdose deaths involving prescription opioids. The second wave began in 2010 with a noticeable rise in overdose deaths involving heroin. The third most recent and deadliest wave began in 2013 with a sharp increase in overdose deaths involving synthetic opioids, particularly illicitly manufactured fentanyl and related substances. Just 2 milligrams of fentanyl, the amount that fits on the tip of a pencil, is considered a potentially lethal dose. As a committee, we began looking at this crisis years ago. We have heard from too many parents who have tragically lost their children to this poison. Between 1999 and 2020, approximately 564,000 people died from overdoses involving an opioid prescription or illicit. In 2021, however, overdose deaths surpassed 100,000, with 67% of those deaths involving fentanyl. Let that sink in. It took 20 years to record a total of 564,000 opioid overdose deaths, and in just 1 year, we saw over 100,000 opioid overdose deaths. You will hear today how communities all across this country are suffering from this poison. During the last 4 years, while we have seen these overdose deaths rise, our colleagues across the aisle have been presented with opportunities to permanently schedule fentanyl-related substances in a bipartisan manner. Instead, they have punted the problem by temporarily scheduling fentanyl-related substances. It is long past time for Congress to permanently schedule fentanyl analogs and other related substances. And fortunately, my home state of Arizona has become the entry point for much of the illicit fentanyl entering our country. Over half of the fentanyl pills seized by the DEA last year were seized in Arizona. 2 weeks ago, law enforcement seized enough fentanyl to kill nearly 800,000 people. If we can roll that video. This was seized in the suburban Tempe suburb of Phoenix metro area. This was found in just one pickup truck. An individual traveling nearly 150 miles from the border was involved in a single vehicle accident, an auto accident, not a drug bust. When law enforcement arrived, they found 286 pounds, 1.3 million pills of fentanyl. And just this week, another 232 pounds of fentanyl worth $3 million was seized by San Diego Border Patrol from a car in San Clemente, California, 75 miles from the border, most of which were pills. I commend that these drugs were seized, but this just makes me more concerned about how many more of these hundreds-pound hauls we never identify that reach their point of distribution, the point where it can enter American towns, often through the mail, via sales that occur on social media. Now, I know our Democrat friends want us to believe that the farcical notion that all of the fentanyl crossing our borders is coming in through our ports of entry. They have said as much in recent hearings. They want you to believe that we're doing a good job detecting and seizing it before it can enter the country and destroy and take American lives. That's simply not true. And I remind them that it is the fentanyl that is actually seized that is found at legal border crossing points or interior checkpoints. That does not account for fentanyl that is not seized. And in fact, in talking to CBP and other DEA officials, I've been told that the actual amount seized is estimated to be somewhere between 10 and 15% of the overall amount of fentanyl that is being introduced into the United States. If we're being honest, it is the fentanyl that is not seized, obviously, that is killing and endangering our children and other members of our society. To ignore the smuggling that occurs between our ports of entry is simply irresponsible and dangerous. Just last month, Chief Patrol Agent John Maudlin of the Tucson sector testified that, quote, last year we seized about 700 pounds of fentanyl. To give you an idea, that's enough to kill everyone in Arizona 21 times, or half the population of the United States. That was encountered, 52% of that was encountered, so the majority of that was encountered in the field, predominantly being backpacked across the border. I'm going to emphasize that. 52% came across being backpacked across at the border. The other 48% was caught at the administration checkpoint. Will you roll the other tape, please? The video you're about to see takes place in Arivaca, just a few miles off of Nogales, about 70 miles as the crow flies southwest of Tucson. Nowhere near a port of entry, you can see. This is a ranch land. Those backpacks are not because they're going to go camping in the desert. They're bringing in illicit drugs. According to CBP statistics, December was the worst month in our nation's history for illegal migration, as measured by encounters of people. And a huge percentage of the drugs apprehended that month were between the ports of entry. When we talk about being between the ports of entry, we refer to drugs not found at a port of entry. In fact, nearly 9,000 pounds of drugs, or 44% of that month's seizures, were found between the ports of entry, contrary to what you hear from our colleagues across the aisle. Job Dickinson, president of the Border Security Alliance, hit the nail on the head when he said that the cartels have, quote, developed a multi-pronged approach as to how to smuggle illegal drugs into this country. They don't just use one avenue, such as the ports of entry. They also use established smuggling routes and remote parts of the borders to get more drugs across, close quote. Cartels are smart enough to avoid sending their inventory through our X-ray and drug-sniffing dogs at the border. They walk it through the gaping, unguarded holes in our border. The number one sector for opioid smuggling is the Tucson sector. Combating this poison and those who smuggle, manufacture, and sell it should be a bipartisan issue. We need to act together to stop this scourge. I recognize in our audience today Mr. Donald Holman. He previously testified on this topic more than 3 years ago. Tragically, like the Rockwells and too many parents across America, he and his family have been forever impacted by this crisis. Mr. Holman lost his son Garrett in 2017 after he took a synthetic opioid delivered through the mail. Since then, Mr. Holman has courageously been a tireless advocate to keep these dangerous drugs out of our communities. I ask unanimous consent to enter a statement from Mr. Holman into the record, and I thank him for his presence here today. Entered into the record. At this point, I now recognize the ranking member, the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for her opening statement.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, and good morning to my colleagues. This is a very important moment, a very serious moment, and a moment of reasoned bipartisanship to fight the scourge of fentanyl. Let me, as I begin, take this opportunity at the outset to express my condolences, Mrs. Rockwell, for the tragic loss of your son, Logan. Thank you for your courage of being here. It is not easy for a mother to speak of the loss of her son. It's not the same thing, but I spent time with the mothers in Uvalde, and it is simply painful. And so your presence here today is a stark reminder, as I said as I walked into this room, that we must be determined to fight the scourge of fentanyl. And we must break the cycle as well of drug addiction, and we must stop the loss of life from this deadly and terrible plague. Thank you for your presence here today. But we must also, as we go forward in this illicit fentanyl, work with our families, work with the nation on drug demands fueled by addiction. We must require the federal government to acknowledge the lessons that they have previously learned, and they must embrace and work bipartisan and include and embrace inclusive strategies that involve aggressive interdiction and community-based treatment. We should not leave families alone. They must have our support. The unprecedented COVID-19 pandemic contributed to the rise in fentanyl-related overdoses beginning in 2019 as treatment, recovery, and prevention services were interrupted and schools, jobs, and mental health support faltered, especially for those suffering from substance abuse disorders. While the previous administration was focused on China building a wall on the southern border, fentanyl came in through the front door and exploded in this country. It is recognizable that China has a major involvement in fentanyl communicating with Mexico. That is, of course, a response that we have to deal with as it relates to that interaction. In 2021, fentanyl was linked to more than 1,600 fatal overdoses in Texas, with African Americans becoming the face of a second national wave of fentanyl-related overdoses. Around the country, many faces were the faces of fentanyl overdoses. Newly released data shows a heightened rate of overdoses in our minority communities, especially among seniors, disproportionately affected by fentanyl addiction, despite an overall decline of overdose rates. Far from the inaction, as the hearing title implies, the Biden administration and Congress have both taken decisive steps to address the scourge of fentanyl. To disrupt the supply chain of fentanyl, Democrats passed the fiscal year 2023 omnibus spending package, which included $60 million to hire 125 additional CBP officers and support personnel at ports of entry, and $70 million to strengthen non-intrusive inspection systems to scan vehicles. I've just come back from the border and talking to our very fine officers. They are working without ceasing. They are going more than the extra mile. We need to give them the resources. They need to be the Superman, Batman, and Mighty Man at the border to be able to assure that fentanyl has a stop sign before it comes into this country. This investment in interdiction resources is critical because the fentanyl supply chain crosses an ocean and several international borders, as I have said. China and increasingly India export most of the chemical precursors to Mexico that are used in the early stages of fentanyl production, where Mexican cartels produce illicit fentanyl products for smuggling to the United States. That is why the Biden administration is working with the Mexican government through several initiatives and redoubling diplomatic efforts to engage China to interrupt the deadly supply chain. Contrary to some expressed opinion, the Mexican cartels primarily use U.S. citizens to drive vehicles and trucks filled with hard-to-detect packages of synthesized fentanyl through lawful ports of entry, while couriers carry and send packages through the U.S. mail and private carriers. We've got to stomp that out. There is one major danger posed by the illicit supply of fentanyl that is particularly troubling: the production of fake or counterfeit pills, which have been found in every state and hold an often deadly secret. It has to be a collective effort. Last year, DEA agents said 4 out of every 10 pills on Houston streets were laced with fentanyl, leading users, including teenagers, to die without knowing what they took. That is why I intend to introduce a bill that will provide grant funding for teachers and other schools to have the necessary adverse drugs that help in other overdose reversal drugs on hand and receive training to administer them properly. My bill will also provide enhanced penalties that do not include mandatory minimums for online sellers and manufacturers of fake pills if death or serious bodily injury occurs. To educate the public, particularly young people and their parents, the Biden administration launched the One Pill Can Kill public awareness campaign to raise awareness of the dangers of fake prescription pills laced with fentanyl. Because the cartels mass-produce fake pills to resemble other Schedule II prescription opioids, such as Oxycontin and Percocet, depressants such as Xanax, or stimulants like Adderall, even casual users of illegal drugs can be drawn into the web of the fentanyl trade with deadly consequences. The hard truth is that we can only temporarily disrupt supply of illicit fentanyl temporarily before another cartel, trafficking method, or analog moves in to take over the market that addiction creates. There is scientific basis to this. We're well aware of this chain of events. We can disrupt the flow, but we must also reduce the demand. Far too long, our country has chosen the wrong approach in fighting drug abuse alone. We've left parents and families, communities alone. Criminalizing addiction when people need treatment is a difficult and challenging pathway, and it impacts all of our communities, young and communities of color. That is why in the last Congress we passed the Rural Opioid Abuse Prevention Act, which several Republicans who sit on this very subcommittee voted against. That legislation provided funding to rural communities to combat the fentanyl crisis that they were facing, in addition to $104 million in grants and assistance the Biden administration allocated to the Rural Communities Opioid Response Program. I can assure you, those rural communities welcomed this help that they had not gotten before. It is important to stress that we must not make the same mistakes of fentanyl, fentanyl-related substances, or the synthetic opioids that we have seen happen before and have not gotten the job done. We've got to get the job done. We cannot have mothers coming to tell us the story of their beloved and beautiful child. As we learned through the crack epidemic of the 1980s, followed by amphetamine in the 1990s, and prescription drugs, and back to heroin once again, we cannot incarcerate our way out of this, out of the scourge of fentanyl and synthetic opioids. I'm concerned that banning the entire class of fentanyl-related substances without safeguards significantly may impact what we have to do in research and finding a way to stop this addiction. I also remain opposed to the expansion of mandatory minimums, penalties that prevent judges from considering the unique facts and circumstances of that addicted person who comes before them. According to most recent statistics from the U.S. Sentencing Commission, there are already significant racial disparities in the prosecution of fentanyl trafficking cases, people of color comprising more than 78% of those sentenced in 2021. The same is true for federal convictions involving fentanyl analogs, which 86% of those people were people of color. We must also be reminded that people who are young are the victims, and we must save them because they must have a future. Of those prosecuted for fentanyl trafficking, less than 5% received a guideline increase for a leadership or supervisory role, and less than 10% of those prosecuted for fentanyl analog trafficking received a leadership or supervisory increase. There is no doubt that we're currently experiencing a crisis, but it is a crisis that Congress and the Biden administration have responded to with urgency and clear eyes, and I would certainly like to emphasize that we should do so on this committee. Just a statistic, in the past year, CBP seized over 260,000 pounds of illicit drugs at the border, including more than 13,000 pounds of fentanyl. In December 2022, as we passed the fiscal year, as I reported, we did $60 million, and we reported another $70 million to strengthen non-intrusive inspection systems that scan vehicles and cargo to disrupt the flow of drugs. We are working intensely. And of course, it shows that Customs and Border Protection data shows that since fiscal 2020, more than 90% of fentanyl, heroin, and methamphetamine seizures occurred at U.S. ports of entry, with almost 97% of all fentanyl seizures happening at ports of entry this fiscal year. We are working to stop the death. And in 2021, U.S. citizens accounted for 86.3% of fentanyl trafficking convictions, compared to just 8.9% of undocumented migrants. Let's get the facts to save lives. Therefore, let's work together. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today, and I hope to have an earnest discussion about solutions to reduce the supply of fentanyl and combat and prevent addiction, and overdoses. We must save lives. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, or Mr. Rankin. Mr. Nadler. Former Mr. Chairman, I now recognize you for your opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, according to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, over 100,000 Americans are dying of drug overdoses each year. Most of these deaths are from fentanyl. The seriousness of the fentanyl crisis cannot be denied. That is why Democrats have been working on solutions to address fentanyl trafficking, addiction, and overdose since it emerged as a threat to our communities. Last Congress, under a Democratic majority, we passed multiple bills to address the opioid epidemic. We passed the Rural Opioid Abuse Prevention Act, which expanded grant eligibility to fund pilot programs in rural areas that focus on reducing overdose deaths. We passed the Bipartisan Fentanyl Results Act, which authorizes 2 State Department programs that combat global drug trafficking. As part of the Consolidated Appropriations Act, we enacted 2 bills that make it easier for providers to offer addiction treatments that combine medication with other services. And we passed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which included $430 million to modernize our ports of entry and help improve CBP's ability to detect illicit drugs. Much of this legislation was bipartisan, but the Republicans on this subcommittee seem to have forgotten that work, and some of them actively opposed it. They titled this hearing "The Fentanyl Crisis in America. Inaction is no longer a problem." Republicans suggest that there has been no action to address this crisis, but they could not be more wrong. There has been action in Congress and by the Biden administration. Some Republicans would prefer different actions. Some Republicans want to incarcerate our way out of this problem, but we know from past experience that this simply does not work. Drug prosecutions generally catch low-level dealers, but very rarely reach the leaders of trafficking organizations. Since cartel leaders can often recruit new dealers, more arrests and longer sentences for low-level dealers does not stop the flow of drugs into our communities. Other Republicans say tough immigration policies and a border wall can stop fentanyl, but the facts are not on their side. While it is true that a great deal of fentanyl comes into the United States from Mexico, it is overwhelmingly U.S. citizens, not migrants, who are bringing it in. Fentanyl is not carried across the border in the middle of the desert, generally. It is driven in commercial trucks and passenger vehicles passing through legal ports of entry. That's why Democrats have supported investments in more law enforcement tools to detect illicit drugs. The fentanyl crisis cannot be used as another justification for mass incarceration or an excuse for harsh immigration policies that do nothing to prevent addiction. While fentanyl is especially deadly, addiction and overdose are not new. We must learn from the failures of our past and treat the fentanyl crisis not as a crime problem, but as a public health problem. We must get to the root causes of addiction and substance abuse, or we will end the war on fentanyl only to have a war on the next, even deadlier drug. We have begun to better understand the nature of addiction, and the public health approach is beginning to take hold. We have shifted the focus from how do we lock more people up to how do we save more lives. This shift has led us to get overdose prevention drugs like naloxone or Narcan to more first responders and more community members. These drugs are saving hundreds of thousands of lives. We are also making sure that those who do come into the criminal justice system because of their addiction receive appropriate treatment, whether through diversion programs that help people rejoin the community without incarceration or through treatment while incarcerated. These programs are not just about helping individuals suffering from addiction. They improve our communities because those who receive treatment are less likely to commit crime and more likely to find employment. Fentanyl continues to be a crisis. It is a crisis that members of both parties are working to address. Today, I hope we can explore more actions we might take together to prevent addiction and get to the root causes of drug abuse. I welcome our colleagues' concern about this issue. I hope they are sincere in their interest in joining this effort. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Maltz. Now we will proceed with the 5-minute rule for questioning. I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Singer, in your testimony, you state, quote, Fentanyl is just the latest manifestation, what drug policy analysts call the iron law of prohibition. The harder the law enforcement, the harder the law. Enforcing prohibition incentivizes those who market prohibited substances to develop more potent forms that are easier to smuggle, end quote. Doctor, I was a law enforcement officer, served in it for 30 years. I was the sheriff of Fort Bend County for 8 years, large agency. And I can tell you, sir, in my humble opinion, you, sir, are wrong. This here is Jose Olivares. He's out of Mexico. Roadside investigation, Highway 59 north of my county, Kendleton, Texas. One of my officers located 10 bundles containing 10,000 tablets of fentanyl. I want to explain something that law enforcement across this country, we save lives. 2 milligrams of fentanyl, 1 lethal dose. 5 milligrams, look at the chart. Are you telling me, sir, that we should not have saved those 25,000 lives that this fentanyl would have killed?
I'm telling you that there's another 25,000 lethal doses right behind that.
I want to show you another example. This is Mr. Luis Garza. Garza was found by my officers, Beasley, Texas, Highway 59 north. During this investigation, my officers located 5 containers of 10,000 Xanax tablets that were discovered to contain fentanyl. Should law enforcement not have protected 25,000 lives that these tablets would have killed?
I'm not
Just say
saying,
yes or no.
yes, they should have.
In your testimony, you state, quote, threatening drug dealers with life imprisonment or the death penalty is also unlikely to deter the drug trade, end quote. Mr. Nadler was up here just a few minutes ago. I'm paraphrasing him. He says, we can't incarcerate ourselves out of this problem. And I'm agreeing with you. I realize that individuals, these drug cartels, drug dealers, they're risking their lives being involved in this business. I understand that. But I support President Trump and his recent comments related to making the sale and distribution of fentanyl a capital crime and the use of the death penalty. I believe this strategy will address this serious problem. And maybe not, it won't solve the problem, but I believe that if you start strapping a few of these ruthless bastards to a gurney and start filling them with the same drug they were selling to kill Americans, it would bring me a great deal of satisfaction. I want to thank those that are here. Ms. Rockwell Logan, I am so sorry. I had dinner with a gentleman last night, lost his 27-year-old son. He was shaking when I was having a conversation with him, and I told him I'm going to be here today. I'm sorry for your loss. I will do everything in my power to secure our southern border, to support our law enforcement, to make America first, to make America great again, and stop this deadly drug from making its way into our communities. Thank you. I yield back. I yield my time.
Thank you for yielding, and thank you for your questioning. I want to make this point because I think it needs to be made based on some of the statements from my friends about this issue, who I think are sincerely concerned as well. The movement of illegal aliens across our southern border is unbelievably high. I mean, we're talking over 2 million encounters last year, not to mention 1 million known gotaways. The Border Patrol is distracted by dealing with those individuals that are surrendering. 1 million people, as I showed in the video earlier, coming across in camo and backpacks. They're not coming on holiday. They're coming to poison our children and our citizens. The border control vacancy that occurs because we have, I know some of you are very familiar with Arizona, the Tohono O'odham Reservation, 62 linear miles on the border. 62 linear miles. Basically times where no one is there to patrol because they're dealing with the surrenders and gotaways. Please remember that. This is coming and pouring across our southern border. With that, the time has expired, and I will yield to the gentlelady, the ranking member from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
I will always say that we need to do this in a fully bipartisan and embracing way. Ms. Rockwell, I want you to, as I listen to you and as well in the other room and as well read your statement, I think we should put on the record that Logan was kind, caring, smart, and creative, and loved animals. And the plight that he faced really should be something that we can find common ground. As I indicated, I'm interested in the manufacturing online, where it gets directly in the hands of a beautiful young man like Logan. So you listen to Mr. Maltz, and I understand that you're a clinical therapist. What about the videos, the involvement of education professionals? What about just getting on the airwaves and making a major campaign? Can that help?
I believe that everything needs to be done to help this problem. We have to hit it at all angles. Absolutely education. I spoke in front of about 120 young kids yesterday morning, and over half of the room had never even heard about fentanyl, and probably 95% never heard about Narcan or naloxone. So education is huge. It's important, just as important as this and the border. I believe it has to be hit from all angles.
Well, we need to take you up on the offer, and let me also offer my sympathy to your husband as well, Dad. We need to take up the loud megaphone, and I think that's what I hear you saying. Dr. Singer, we need to do this in the right way, and so I need you to be as focused and precise on this question about dealing with fentanyl in a manner that is going to be effective. And the question of research and the medical use, can you explain how important, and that is even this scourge of the epidemic of attacking our nation in terms of addiction and deaths, how do you interject the fentanyl research so that we can be common sense focused to save lives, but to deal with the research that medicine needs to do?
Thank you, Representative Jackson Lee. Yes, actually, as we know from past experience, classifying a particular category of a fentanyl analog as Schedule I, meaning no accepted medical use, basically cuts off any opportunity to do research on the drug going forward. And I think nobody can ever know that there's not going to be something good discovered. We cut off psychedelics 50 years ago from research, and just now we're starting to realize the many useful, many lives that could have been saved over the last 50 years, but research was completely suppressed. And the FDA is about to finally legalize MDMA maybe this year. Marijuana is still Schedule I, and could anybody with a straight face say that it has no accepted medical use? So first of all, just as a matter of principle, to completely block research into a certain area because you've decided in advance that it's not going to lead to anything positive. I don't know how anybody could ever know that. They probably laughed at people who suggested you can get penicillin from a bread mold, but we did. So that's number one. Number two, I think it's a distraction to focus on permanently outlawing FRSs because, as Dr. Westlake himself admitted, it did nothing to lower the overdose crisis. We're here to be focused on why are people dying from fentanyl overdoses, and this is sort of like a little shiny object on the side. So we get rid of FRSs. Meanwhile, I think the next thing we're going to be dealing with is nitazines or tranq. We're already hearing in the East Coast cities We're hearing horrible stories about xylazine making its way with fentanyl and other products.
Let me pose some other questions. Dr. Westlake indicated that the creation of a new fentanyl-related substance had ground to a halt internationally. Do you agree with that proposition?
I really don't know you could say that. Just like it's been said on this committee that we don't know how many smugglers have smuggled.
And then my
fentanyl
last point is
across the border.
the drugs that provide the adverse reaction, alcohol and others drugs, how important it is that our communities have access to that, schools, police, et cetera.
Are you talking about
The gentlelady's time's
reversals?
expired,
Yes,
but
yes.
you can answer the question,
Thank you,
Dr.
Mr.
Singh.
Chairman.
I think it's very important that drugs that block or are antidotes to the opioid-related overdose deaths are made readily available. Naloxone has been around since the 60s, and there's good reason to believe from recent reports from the Food and Drug Administration they may actually make it available over the counter this coming month of March. So let's hope they do.
I will engage with you on that. Thank you so very much. I think it's very important.
Thank you. The gentlelady's time has expired, but I'm going to recognize her for a point of personal privilege to introduce a guest she has today.
I'm delighted. I know that she'll take this information and we will collaborate together, but I'm delighted to have Councilmember Carol Evans-Shabazz, represents what we call District D for Destination in Houston, Texas, who is here to advocate for children, for economic involvement or investment, and to represent the city of Houston. Thank you so very much for being here.
Thank you and welcome. Glad to have you with us today. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and certainly I appreciate all the witnesses being here today. And Ms. Rockwell, we are certainly give our condolences to you and your family for the loss of Logan. Thank y'all for being here. It takes a lot of courage to do what you did today, but I think more than anything, that's an opportunity from a personal standpoint to reach so many children in this country who need to hear that story coming from a mom's mouth and telling it like it is out there. So thank you again for being here, and we appreciate that. And Mr. Maltz, I've been to the border three times, and the one thing that I think that the Biden border policies have done, they've created, number one, we have an invasion on the southern border, 5 million people since he's been in office encounters. The one thing that I noticed that it kind of concerned me, and I don't know if you've heard this, but there's a price now for human beings to be shipped across our southern border, and they're dealing with the cartels. And so the prices we heard were about, well, this is a few years ago, but last week the testimony in Yuma, Arizona is now $6,000 a head if you want to come into the U.S. from Mexico or Guatemala, any of the Triangle Nations. And if you're coming from Russia, it's up to $19,000. 100 countries, I think 106 countries come through Yuma. But the thing now that in our we talk about securing those points of entry on the border, and I assume we're spending some money and doing that wisely, but the thing is the porous border between those points of entry, the cartel have figured this out. And so I was told, and I don't know if you've heard this and maybe you can help shed some light, but many of these people don't have the money to come to the U.S. And so they cut a deal with the cartel. And there's one of two options. They're either going to be indentured servants or slaves. They're going to make payments to the cartel. But the other option was backpacking heroin, cocaine, or fentanyl across the U.S. southern border. Have you heard of any of those stories? We're just trying to get to the bottom of what these policies are doing and why we're seeing such an influx of people, number one, and drugs, number two.
Thank you for the question. I mean, the cartels run a multi-billion-dollar enterprise, and as you pointed out, there are some experts that suggest they're making more money from the migrant smuggling now than drug smuggling. But they are doing whatever it takes to get their poisonous drugs into this country because they want to drive addiction, and they also want to make as much money as they can. So I have talked to Homeland Security experts that obviously are very concerned for the national security of the country because we've never seen anything like this in the history of the country. And I just want to make it clear to everyone in the room, this is nothing we've ever seen. So there are so many migrants coming in, and it's just unknown. We don't know what we don't know. That's why I get a kick out of this POE, concept, because there's more deaths in America than we've ever seen. There's more seizures at the POE and the border that we've ever seen, and there's more seizures throughout America by law enforcement than we've ever seen. So obviously, putting some more X-ray machines at the POE is really awesome. I appreciate that, but that's not going to stop the tsunami of deadly drugs coming into this country. That's why we got to destroy those production labs and can't rely on Mexico to do it.
That's a very valid point. Richard Nixon, 50 years ago, he started the war on drugs with just over 6,000 deaths in this country. We had 107,000 people die last year from fentanyl poisoning. And unfortunately, many of them are young and they're getting younger, 18 to 45, I think. So, you know, you talk about they'll stop at nothing. We actually, one spot in the border, y'all remember the two little girls they dropped over the border, the 3-year-old and the 5-year-old? They climbed up a ladder at the top of that wall, I don't know, it was 14, 15 feet, and the cartel dropped those 2 children. And as the border agents, we went to that spot, as the border agents ran to that spot, there was an opening 1 mile away where they were shipping their drugs through. So they used those children as decoys, and that's what they're doing with these migrants. They'll send them in waves across the southern border, and as a CBP, the CBP is now nothing more than a concierge service. They can't focus on stopping the drugs because they're too busy trying to process people in and get them to the points of entry or wherever they've got to take them to get them shipped in a bus to somewhere in our country. But anyway, I want to thank you for being here, sir, all of y'all for being here. And Mr. Chairman, I'll yield the remainder of my time to you.
Thank you, Mr. Moore. So we heard about that U.S. citizens are driving and bringing fentanyl up. They're coming through the ports of entry. Now, why is that? Because the cartels are hiring U.S. citizens because it's easier for a U.S. citizen to actually drive through a port of entry than a foreign national. But it's the cartel that's controlling it. Even our testimony last week said there is nobody that enters the U.S. without the cartel controlling it. And I'll give you an example. We went out in this ridiculous caravan the other night to go to the border. As I got in there, caravan I said, nobody's coming, because the cartel would see 30 cars coming, and they're not going to allow anybody to come. Nobody came. Not until everybody had gone, and then they started the flow again. Ladies and gentlemen, we don't even control our own southern border. I regret to tell you that we've been called for votes on the floor. I'd ask our witnesses to please, you may take a recess. We will probably be back here in about 45 minutes, and we're going to be in a recess for 45 minutes, and then we'll continue the hearing. Thank you. We're in recess. Thank you for being back here. Our recess lasted a little bit longer than we anticipated due to votes. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Gates.
Dr. Singer, in your testimony, you talked about the market demand for fentanyl, for drugs generally, but specifically for fentanyl. And I guess I wanted to assess the utility of that analysis in the context of a drug that is often spliced into other things that people are using. Ma'am, did your son seek out fentanyl? Was he part of the market demand for fentanyl?
Absolutely not. He bought a pill on Snapchat, a blue Perk 30, and it had fentanyl in it.
And Mr. Maltz, in your extensive experience at DEA, do you find that fentanyl is being laced into what people believe to be Percocet?
100%, yes.
And Xanax as well?
Yes, sir.
And marijuana?
There are cases of marijuana. We don't know the extent of that, but there have been fatalities reported with fentanyl in marijuana, yes.
MDMA and ecstasy? Do we see
Not sure about too much of that, but definitely in heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine. But more importantly, it's the pure fentanyl that's in the pills and the powder. And they're making these pills, millions of them every day. There's pill press locations.
I get that you would think about something as an overdose. If someone was seeking out fentanyl, they believed they were taking a certain amount of it, they end up taking more, and they end up overdosing. But if someone thinks that they're using a different substance, that doesn't strike me as an overdose, that strikes me as a poisoning. Yeah, Dr. Singer, I'd love your thoughts on it, because probably on the Republican side, I am the easiest to concur that the war on drugs is one that has been won by drugs.
Yeah, well, Congressman Gates, maybe you misunderstood me. There are some people who actually want fentanyl, but for the most part, it's prohibition and the black market that it created that is responsible for this. Because as I mentioned about the iron law of prohibition, that is what incentivizes the cartels to come up with more potent forms. So initially, around 2012 or so, we were seeing fentanyl appear as a mixture with heroin to boost its potency so that they could smuggle it in smaller amounts and sell it into more units. Then it really got accelerated when the cartels realized it's easier to synthesize. You don't have to rely on the opium poppy being shipped. And the reason why we're seeing so many innocent people who are, for example, buying a Percocet, they think, even Prince, he liked to use Vicodin. And his dealer, he thought his dealer got him Vicodin, but the toxicology reports showed he died of a fentanyl overdose. It wasn't in those cases that people were seeking fentanyl. It's that this is what happens when you have a black market.
Sure.
So
I wanted to ask you a little bit about those relationships between the dealers and the users. I found a tweet of yours from back in 2019 where you say, when people cross political borders, they're not violating anyone's rights, given that they are simply exercising their natural God-given rights of freedom of travel, economic liberty, freedom of contract, and freedom of association. When you say freedom of contract, like, are you talking about the contract between the drug traffickers and the users?
No, I'm talking about a contract, for example, between a farmer and somebody who is offering to work on their farm and help pick crops, for example.
I'm glad you mentioned the farmer, because we were just in Yuma, Arizona, and we met with a lot of the growers. These are like third, fifth generation growers, and what they tell us about their freedoms and their property rights that I think Cato cares deeply about, is that they get violated by migrants who defecate in their fields, who create contamination for the food supply, and these are not insurable losses. So they just have to eat these losses. And like, does the violation of the property rights of the farmers you mentioned,
Of course,
concern you?
that would be trespassing on private property. So
Right, but don't you think that the open borders policies that you've advocated for increase the frequency of that violation of people's property rights?
people have no right to come on someone else's property without their permission. I'm not here as an immigration expert, but I can tell you as a libertarian, the overarching principle is that our fundamental inalienable rights are not limited to people in the United States. It's a human phenomenon. All humans have the right to freedom of movement.
But not across somebody else's property, right?
I beg your pardon?
Not across somebody's private property.
Not private property, no.
Do you think that everybody in the world has freedom of movement across our border?
Unfortunately, no.
But you would like that to be the case.
Well, I think borders are for governments and not for people.
I don't know, Dr.
Borders
Silver.
define
I
where
would observe that
laws-
governments have to govern the conduct of people, and that the role of our government is to secure our border, and that if it's open, it's the property rights you're concerned about and the life and health of our fellow Americans that continues to degrade. But I appreciate the colloquy and appreciate all the witnesses being here. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. I call upon and recognize the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Dean.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all of our witnesses for testifying today for this important discussion. First, let me extend my sincerest sympathies to the Rockwell family for your indescribable loss of Logan, to you, your husband, and your son. I'm very sorry for the loss of your beautiful boy. You have lived a nightmare that many parents fear. My family faced the diabolical opioid crisis ravaging this country because our middle son was addicted to opioids, and we went through an awful lot of trauma around that and misunderstanding him and what was affecting him. And he is now 10 years in recovery. And I think it is really only but for timing, perhaps, that we didn't lose him to fentanyl, because 10 years ago, it was not so prevalent. So God bless you and God bless Logan. And I want you to know that we have a bipartisan new caucus, and it is bipartisan, to work in a bipartisan way, and it's called the Bipartisan Fentanyl Prevention Caucus. So I'm delighted to join Rep. Issa, Rep. Neguse, as well as Rep. Calvert to work on this issue, to save lives. During both the Trump and Biden administrations, the federal government noted increasing numbers of overdose deaths. People have said it here today, 108,000 in 2021, 70% of those involving fentanyl poisoning. So treating fentanyl and related substances with severity, as the Biden administration and the Trump administration did, is one step Just last year, Congress authorized $60 million for additional CBP officers and $70 million for inspection technologies. All of those things are what we must do. We know that much of these substances is coming through legal ports of entry. The result of that investment was an additional 13,000 pounds of fentanyl seized. So I wanted to just ask you, Mrs. Rockwell, if you'd like to say just a little bit about Logan, and then I was going to ask Dr. Singer for some public health recommendations.
Well, obviously, Logan, thank you. Logan was very young when he passed. He was 19. So he was our oldest son. He was a real good kid. He was a vulnerable kid. And, you know, we sort of felt like we obviously lost out on so much of his life. Logan, the night he passed, he was upset. He was distraught. He was extremely upset. His girlfriend and him were fighting. And he was on FaceTime and took the pill while his girlfriend was on FaceTime with her. He sought out the pill on social media, and I mean, that's how he passed.
I'm very, very sorry, and this committee has heard from other parents who have lost the indescribable, heart-crushing loss. Dr. Singer, in your testimony, you talked about the sadly, natural progression of this drug crisis. This one began with pharmaceuticals, evolved to heroin, then fentanyl, now synthetics, and now we're even talking about tranq and some other horrific substances. What are the right public health solutions? I really believe we have to think outside the box. We can't be afraid to embrace that people, not just addicts, but those who are addicted and those who are just experimenting are at grave risk of death. So what are the public health things we should be doing?
Well, thank you for that question. In fact, what we need to do is, instead of just focusing on the supply side, we need to focus on protecting people who are using drugs from the dangers of fentanyl and other even more deadly contaminants. I have a chapter actually in the Cato Handbook for Policymakers that was just released that deals with this. Among the things that this committee could do is, for example, our drug paraphernalia laws make it illegal for a person to hand out a fentanyl test strip, or now they make xylazine test strips for tranq, because that's considered drug paraphernalia as testing equipment. Many states are changing their laws to allow that. Both red and blue states, South Dakota did last week, Arizona did a year ago, but there's also federal paraphernalia laws. Another very important thing, in my opinion, is for this committee to consider either repealing or amending 21 U.S. Code Section 856, also called the Crack House Statute. I have a policy brief that came out yesterday about this. Overdose prevention centers have existed throughout the developed world since 1986, when they first started in Switzerland. They're in 16 countries. There are 147 of them in 91 locations. We are an outlier. 38 are in Canada, 25 are in Germany, 14 are in Switzerland. But we're an outlier because our federal law prohibits people from helping their neighbors by setting up centers where they can be brought inside and used in a safe environment and have people standing by with naloxone.
I see my time has expired. I thank you both for the conversation, and I couldn't agree with you more. I said to people in my district—
The gentlelady's time has expired.
I agree with your recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you. Gentleman recognized chair recognized the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Tiffany.
Thank you very much. Ms. Rackwell, you make all of us Wisconsinites proud today. Do you know the statistics from 2019 to 2021? There's nearly a doubling of the number of deaths in Wisconsin from fentanyl. Is any state exempt from this in your travels? And
I agree with you, Mr. Tiffany. From what I believe, in those 2 years, Wisconsin's percentage was about 97% increase. And in my opinion, with the experience that we have, which I feel is probably, early in its stages, because Logan, it's been very recent, but I think every single state is experiencing an increase. Our kids are at risk Every single kid is at risk, and even if there's kids that we're not seeing, some kids are not dying, but they're dealing with addiction issues as well, very young, because these cartels, these pills they're being made to drive addiction. That's what they want. They want these kids to be addicted. It's a business. So, but I do believe it's everywhere.
And is this why you said everything has to be done in order to try to get this under control?
Absolutely. If we miss one little loophole, that's why we're seeing numbers go up. I mean, there's some things being done, but everything has to be done. It has to be done at every angle.
Dr. Westlake, it's also good to have you from the great state of Wisconsin here also. And I want to thank you. I voted for the HOPE agenda in Wisconsin, which you helped put together, which was really groundbreaking, wasn't it, in America, first of its kind.
Yes.
You're an emergency room doctor. What does death look like from fentanyl?
Right. So opioids just cause respiratory suppression, so people just stop breathing, and then they pass out, and then they turn blue, and then they die, if not resuscitated.
So it's almost like they're being smothered?
Or the same thing with an execution. It can be the same thing as a chemical execution.
So it's similar to a chemical execution?
Right.
Many of the critics of FRS scheduling, Dr. Westlake, cite concerns with mandatory minimums and the sentencing guidelines, insisting that this criminal justice framework will do nothing to prevent FRS market saturation. Can you briefly explain why it's important to permanently keep this on Schedule 1 with the associated criminal penalties?
Great. Yeah, thanks for the question. So criminal penalties do not stop use of drugs. Drug users are going to use drugs. People with substance abuse disorder are going to use drugs. Traffickers, as Dr. Singer said, are going to traffic drugs regardless of the penalties. But what this does, and where this is novel, and where I think this is not some shiny object that's distracting from the purpose, this closes off the spigot of fentanyl-related substances. So this targets the legal chemical companies in China from stopping creating fentanyl-related substances. According to the GA report in 2021, it has accomplished that. There's relatively no new fentanyl-related substances being created. So you've got this big faucet of illicit fentanyl, which is a huge problem. Right now, the spigot for fentanyl-related substances is turned off, but it could reopen. And I think the 2,500 people that died in Florida from fentanyl-related substances that were legal in 2016 to 2017 would disagree that fentanyl-related substances is a shiny object.
Mr. Maltz, what we basically heard from the other side is that immigration is not a problem. We didn't hear that in the testimony from Sheriff Daniels, Cochise County, Arizona, and the sheriff from Yuma County over the last month. Do you agree with the sheriffs that immigration has fostered this increase in fentanyl coming across the border?
100%. The country's being invaded. There's migrants coming from over 160 countries. They're looking to get here for a better life, many of them, okay? But we also have terrorists, we have rapists, we have sexual predators, we have criminals coming over that border every day. There's over 1 million gotaways coming into the country. Here's the problem, Congressman. The people in this town don't listen to the experts that know what they're talking about, that have been there on the border. Chairman Biggs goes down there, like many of you go down there and talk to the experts, not reading it in the Washington Post.
Sir, yeah, I just need my final 15 seconds here, but thank you for that. If for no other reason, let's set aside the human trafficking and the largest human trafficking network that has been set up in the history of the world. Set it aside. We have the greatest number of people on the terror watch list come across our border, correct?
Yes.
Set that aside. If for no other reason, for fentanyl, we should be securing the border. I yield back.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, is it Rockwall? Mrs. Rockwall, I was here when you testified, and I'm very sorry about your son and the circumstances, your husband as well. Did the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, after your son's overdose, do anything to start to inform students about drugs and have some type of a public interest program there, public information?
Did
Did Wisconsin-Milwaukee do anything?
The university?
Yes, ma'am.
They did after we respectfully pushed them and continued to push them. We were able to get naloxone boxes installed across the campus for safety, and then we were also able to have them instill a freshman program so that the students were aware of what to do and the signs, et cetera, posters up, all of those kinds of things.
Well, thank you for what you did. And do you know if that's been done in other colleges?
In Wisconsin specifically, 90% of the University of Wisconsin system does have the naloxone boxes, and they are following suit with that. But, you know, every school's different, so there's not a unified approach at this point.
And as far as they have like an orientation, they tell them about drugs and warn them?
Correct.
Who do they have do that? Do you know? Is it a police person, or is it a community person, an athlete, or what?
Not an athlete. The police are involved. In fact, actually, as we speak today, here, right now, there's a program at the university today that we were supposed to speak at that our board is actually presenting for us. So there are speaking events that we are being involved in, but also the substance department of the school and the police.
Thank you. Thank you. I don't know who to ask the question to. Maybe Mr. Maltz, if you can not go over the top with me. I've got ear problems, but whatever. What works? Dr. Singer, you can answer this too, or Dr. Westlake. What has proven to work to reduce? Dr. Singer, you got an answer, please?
Well, in many other countries, they don't have our overdose problem, even though there's a drug problem in a lot of Europe. So, for example, in Switzerland, in Germany, in Portugal, in France, and Spain, they've put much more of in Canada, they put much more of an emphasis on harm reduction. Harm reduction, the concept of harm reduction is to non-judgmentally do things for people that can make whatever choices they're making less dangerous. That comes natural to doctors, because in this country and in most developed countries, that's largely what we do. When I have a patient,
how do you do that? Having Narcan around?
When it comes to drugs, you could, again, make it easier for people to get the overdose antidote naloxone, allow people to get test strips to test to see if what they purchased on the black market is what they think it is, see if it has fentanyl or xylazine. But also there are many groups in this country that want to set up these overdose prevention centers, which have been proven there's not been one overdose taking place. There are two that are right now in defiance of federal law operating in New York City. They started in November 2021, and by April of 2022, they'd already reversed 230 overdose deaths. Those are 230 people who would have been dead. So, but they're not allowed to do that because
is that the only place they have it is in New York City?
I beg your pardon?
That only place that has that program is in New York?
Well, in November 2021, the mayor of New York, in defiance of 21 USC Section 856, permitted a nonprofit private harm reduction organization to operate 2 overdose prevention centers, and they've been functioning, and so far the Justice Department hasn't acted on it.
Okay, thank you. You know, I think all of us would like to see this reduced, eliminated if possible. And Mr. Maltz, I appreciate your work in the past, but you know, I don't know if the idea of the death penalty is a good idea, because the reality is, and this is just, you know, my guess, I don't think people who buy the fentanyl think they're going to overdose. So they buy it. So they've heard it's a fun trip or a good trip or whatever. And I suspect that the people that deal it don't think they're going to get caught. Even if you have the death penalty, they don't think I'm going to get caught. So I don't know if that's the answer. I think we have busted a lot of the cartels, have we not? I don't know their names. Is it Pablo Escobar, somebody we got and put away?
Sir, first of all, I apologize for yelling and screaming, but you know what? I've been dealing with the families for many years, and there's no action going on in this town. So I will tell you this.
I will tell you. Action.
Let me answer the question. First of all, I would appreciate if you stop calling it an overdose. It's a poisoning, and it's a war against our kids. So stop with the overdosing. That's part of the problem. The American public thinks it's a substance that people want to take.
My time is expired. I yield back.
Your time is
Chairman,
expired. Did you finished answering the question, Mr. Maltz?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Gates.
Mr. Chairman, I seek unanimous consent that Mr. Issa be permitted to sit on the panel for the purpose of accepting the yielding of time.
Without objection?
Without objection, I am ready to allow Mr. Issa to be on. And Ms. Issa, I will be joining the caucus that you'll be speaking of, so I hope that you and Congresswoman Dean will add me to that caucus. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I recognize Mr. Jordan. Mr. Issa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Chairman. The title of this hearing should be, inaction is no longer an option. And so one of the questions that you had said was you're tired of nothing happening in this town. That's because we've had inaction as we've gone from 0 to 108,000 deaths a year with fentanyl. In San Diego, we have a locker that has 147,000 pounds of deadly drug. A third of it is fentanyl. 10 years ago, 0 was fentanyl, and it was mostly marijuana and meth. So when we look at what we need to do, and I'll just be brief and say, what would you have us do on a bipartisan basis that would be the most effective single item? And we'll start on the left.
So, Congressman, thanks for the question. First of all, we have to declare this a public health and national security emergency from the White House, because it all starts at the top. Then we have to get celebrities and professional athletes, role models, to start making video reels to get to the kids on social media. Because right now on social media, that's what they're doing all day. And that's why they're dying, because they're buying this stuff on social media. And by the way, sextortion is also very big on social media. So why are the social media companies allowed to facilitate the death and destruction of our communities?
Okay, and I appreciate that, because that is one of the areas that information simply certainly is not equal to the 108,000 deaths. From a standpoint of, and I'll ask this, I'll start at the far right here now. When someone knowingly produces a pill that looks like one kind of drug but is in fact fentanyl, in California they've had the novel attempt to in fact have, when someone dies of it, have it be considered murder because it's a knowing act. Would you support a federal law that made it, in fact, by definition, murder to produce a deadly fentanyl pill that appears to be something else?
Congressman, yes, absolutely. If I took a drink and I got something poisoned in the drink and died, that would be murder, correct?
Correct. So those are two areas. The third one, of course, is we have two partners in this. We're the third partner because we're the buyer, and certainly we have to do our part. And this is where information and getting beyond just ignoring it is important. But let me just ask the two questions. Mexico is currently enjoying a gang success of billions of dollars that is corroding the variability of their government to manage their country, because the cartels have more money than the government. And that's coming out of China, where the precursors come out. So the question I have for all of you is, as we're advertising, as we're increasing the crimes, what action should we take to stem the flow from China through Mexico? Yes.
Again, so when you look at the spigot of illicit fentanyl, that's a huge issue, and I'm not here to really focus on that. I'm focusing on fentanyl-related substances, and one thing Congress can do tomorrow is permanently close that loophole.
Yes, sir.
Congressman, we've been doing the same thing over and over again for 50 years since President Nixon declared war on drugs, and expecting a different result each time, and doing it even harder and causing even more people to be in prison and damaging relations with even more countries, still not going to work. I guarantee you, because we're going to probably be here in a couple of years talking about the nitazene crisis. I think we should put the emphasis and focus on making it safer for the people who are going to continue to go to the black market and use drugs by getting the government out of the way of groups that want to employ harm reduction strategies that save lives.
I appreciate your view on that. I respectfully disagree. The countries that have tried it mostly have had other problems. But I do agree with one thing, which is that we have been fighting the fight for a long time. We've seen the drugs change. Ma'am, I'm going to close by saying I meet regularly with one after another parent or sibling or spouse of someone who has died from the, and whether they call it an overdose or a deadly poison, most of the time it's an amount that is deadly in a single pill. That is not true of other drugs. It is true of fentanyl today. And so you have my deepest sympathies for your loss, and we will, I promise, we will have action, not inaction. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Issa. Chair recognizes Mr. Kiley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to follow up on a point raised just now by Mr. Issa, but first I wanted to also say thank you to Ms. Rockwell for being here and sharing your story. I know how difficult it is and how much courage it takes. I've had the chance to work with parents who, like yourself, have found themselves in an unthinkable situation, including two parents, Chris and Laura Didier, who were my guests at the State of the Union a couple weeks ago. And I think it's because of the power of your voice and the voices of people like the Didiers and other parents who have had that courage that the president did at least acknowledge the scale of this problem in his State of the Union address, the largest platform that he has as president. Mr. Chair, we heard from the ranking member that this is not a crime problem. And I would have to take issue with that statement. After all, we're talking about a poison that largely originates with dedicated criminal organizations and that is peddled in our communities by dealers to unsuspecting young people under false pretenses using social media or any other means at their disposal. So yes, there are multiple dimensions to this problem. First and foremost, securing the border, raising awareness, but holding criminals accountable is a very important dimension. And in that respect, we actually have some very recent news out of my district. In the last 2 days, there's been a preliminary hearing for a defendant, the drug dealer Carson Shu. His victim was a 20-year-old soon-to-be father named Cade Webb, who died of fentanyl poisoning after consuming a fake pill. Some may actually have heard about his story because he is the cousin of Logan Webb, who's the star pitcher for the San Francisco Giants, who after the tragedy used his position to share the story to raise awareness, and then other Major League Baseball players did so as well. So yesterday, the preliminary hearing concluded, and this happened to take place in Placer County, where the DA's office, led by District Attorney Morgan Geyer, has been very committed to using every tool at their disposal to get a handle on the fentanyl crisis. They've been part of public awareness campaigns like One Pill Can Kill, and they have been very aggressive in using the criminal laws to hold dealers accountable, under the belief that anyone who sells this lethal substance and doesn't care whether their customer lives or dies is guilty of murder. So in the death of Cade Webb, and in prosecuting the dealer, Carson Shu, they decided to charge him with murder, because that's what this is. And yesterday, there was a holding order in the case, and it is now going to go to trial, and this drug dealer will face murder charges for selling this lethal substance to this young man in our community. So I would just encourage prosecutors across the country to take a look at what the district attorney's office is doing under the leadership of Morgan Geyer in Placer County. Because yes, I think we need stiffer penalties, and that does need to be legislated. But there's a lot we can do under existing criminal laws. And since Placer County started being more aggressive in prosecuting dealers, law enforcement is hearing about results on the street that dealers are now wary of selling in our community. So I'd just ask the question to Mr. Maltz. You know, we've heard that this isn't a crime problem. We've heard that having stiffer penalties for the dealers isn't going to really do anything. Does that perspective resonate more with your experience, or does the perspective of the law enforcement in my district that this actually is serving as a real deterrent sound more realistic to you?
Well, there's leadership in California. I know in San Diego they have Task Force 10 with the DEA and Homeland Security, other agencies, and they're prosecuting defendants for the death of these kids that are dying. But I will tell you this, I talk to DEA agents every day, and you know why they're upset right now? Because the Department of Justice is putting out more guidance and more restrictions and more requirements to charge minimum mandatory sentences for people that are killing our kids. Like, it doesn't get any simpler. If they're killing our kids, they need to feel the pain and go to jail. It's not going to stop the problem because there's so many kids addicted. Because right now in America, there's a lot of anxiety, social, depression. COVID caused a lot of this. So these kids are turning to these pills, and they have no idea what they're getting. But my thing is, they have to be told that the pills will kill you. They don't know that because they're not getting the messages. They're not watching this hearing. They're not watching mainstream media, cable news. That's why the athletes and the celebrities have to be called to the White House, and they have to participate. And they got to put China aside because of the big money they make, and they have to go and they educate the kids and save lives.
Thank
you, Mr. Maltz. I yield back.
Thank you. Now recognize the gentlelady from Georgia, Ms. McBath.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first, I want to give my deepest condolences to the Rockwell family. I am so sorry for your loss. I, too, have lost a child. And, you know, it's just so heartbreaking because it's not the natural order of things. So I do give you my deepest condolences. And for many across America, this epidemic is just a symptom of neglect. We have heard how far-reaching and fast-growing this public health crisis has become. What started as a plan by big pharmaceutical companies to profit on the pain of millions, a plan to shroud the addictiveness of these drugs in sales tactics and consultant speak, has changed the course of our country and the Americans who live in it. We know the facts, they've been spouted all day. We've heard many of them here today. Millions of Americans addicted to opioids led us into an era of millions of Americans addicted to heroin, fentanyl, a drug up to 50 times stronger than heroin, pushed on our people by cartels most often supplied by the PRC, and has only increased these deaths of despair. We know the facts, but we don't always know what goes on in these homes. When we zoom into a home, when we see a family, we see parents that are shattered by a loved one, lost in the grips of a drug that has consumed them. We see the wife in West Virginia, whose husband came home in pain every night from work, that left them battered and bruised. The overprescribed opioid that was supposed to be a cure for the pain became the cause of it. As addiction took hold, opioids were replaced with heroin, heroin laced with fentanyl, and now 2 children are growing up without a father, supported now by a single mother who just saw the love of their life descend into darkness. We see the father in Florida who just dropped his son off in his freshman dorm room. Since he was a little boy, he had always followed the rules. A quarterback on his high school team, he had always been the calm and quiet type, but a concussion followed him to college. Now he was a child away from home, surrounded by his peers. He spent a night with his friends doing what many college kids do. It took 1 pill to overdose, and now the father who spent 18 years raising a son he could never be more proud of would never see his boy again. We see the daughter in Georgia bullied in her high school for being too fat one day and too thin the next, for trying too hard in school and not hard enough on her looks. When a friend promises an escape from the terror in her head and the pain in her heart, she accepts gratefully, until the drugs had a hold on her, until the painkillers decided what she was doing and when she would do it. Her overdose on heroin was called a death of despair, but that only scratched the surface. Her mother and father are now forced to celebrate her birthday at her gravesite. There is a heartbreak only reserved for those who question whether they've done more as a parent to save their child, a spouse, a child. And when you focus in on a community, when you enter a home filled with that heartbreak, which I do understand, you can only begin to understand the human cost of this crisis. These drugs have profited on pain and left only death and despair in their wake. This isn't the future for us as Americans, and this isn't time for politics. This is the time for progress. And what we do here must help to solve this crisis, not score political points. So please, Dr. Singer, what can we do right now that will give us the best chance of saving American lives, ending this epidemic, and keeping our families together?
Congresswoman McBath, thank you for that question. As I've said previously, and this is under the purview of this committee, I think we should focus on trying to make the black market less dangerous for people who are going to go into the black market to purchase drugs by allowing them to be able to use, for example, test strips to test to see if they think they're buying a Percocet and it turns out it's fentanyl. We can help them by letting them know that and maybe avoid taking it. Also, we should remove Section 21 U.S.C. Section 856 so that harm reduction organizations around the country could set up overdose prevention centers to prevent people from overdosing. And also in those centers, they test their drugs before they use them, and they use them with clean needles and syringes, which they have to return. And it's outside of the public view, so people don't have to watch people use drugs. So these are things that this committee could address. Also, in many countries, Canada, the UK, Australia, since the 60s, primary care physicians have been able to prescribe take-home methadone. But in this country, we have this very burdensome process where in order to use methadone, which is a very effective treatment for addiction, you have to go to a special clinic. You sometimes have to travel miles. You have to take it in the presence of a clinic staff because you're stigmatized as somebody who can't be trusted. Whereas if you were able to during the pandemic, actually, they allowed take-home medication. We saw no evidence of diversion or misuse of the methadone. If we allowed primary care practitioners to prescribe methadone to treat substance use disorder, then there'd be many more avenues where people can access methadone treatment.
Thank you, and I yield my time.
Thank you. Chair recognizes now the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Frey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing. Appreciate your leadership and bringing attention to this to the panel. Thank you for being here. Ms. Rockwell, thank you. It's incredibly brave for you to address this committee, to share that story. When I was in the South Carolina General Assembly, I chaired the House Opioid Abuse Prevention Study Committee. We had 18 bills, record funding, a lot of great things, but we always started every field hearing with people who who were recovering, who had lost family members. To hear their stories, to hear your story today reminds me of that and how important it is to hear that story, that we start from the human element and that we remember the families back home who have suffered the most. The rise in fentanyl, I think the frustration that I have, at least up here, to the panel is that states and local governments have really tried to address this from an education campaign to prevention to treatment to law enforcement. That was not immune to the state of South Carolina either as we tried to pass legislation to address it. But the frustration that I have is that we can't actually deal, and states can't, as inventive as they are, and colleges and local governments, they cannot actually deal with the problem until we deal with the source, which is fentanyl, which is China, which is the cartels. To me, to look at the numbers in South Carolina, and of course this mirrors the country, in 2017, South Carolina saw a 312% increase in fentanyl-related overdoses. From 2019 to 2021, it was 178%. Nearly 69%, according to a South Carolina Department of Health and Environmental Control, 69% of all overdoses are related to fentanyl. Those numbers back up, and those have been increasing dramatically, whereas in 2017, only 36% of overdose deaths were related to fentanyl. So we have seen this problem exacerbated. We just visited Yuma, Arizona for a field hearing where we talked to hospital systems and ranchers and residents, and they're seeing it in their communities. And of course, as we know, every state, every local government, every community is a border town at this point, given the amount of fentanyl overdoses that are taking place. Mr. Chairman, at this point, I'd like to seek unanimous consent to put the South Carolina Department of Health and Environmental Control overdose report into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think from the perspective of the DEA, Mr. Maltz, what are some of the firsthand experiences that you've seen or heard of your agents, of the agents of the DEA dealing with drug smugglers? What are some of the experiences that they have had in the field?
Well, they're very frustrated for the lack of the support. Like I said, the Department of Justice put in added requirements to put people in jail that are killing our kids. But the real frustration that I've seen is kind of highlighted in the recent trial in New York and the conviction of Genaro Garcia Luna. He was the FBI equivalent in Mexico. The corruption is so systemic in Mexico that the cartels run the country. And now with the migrant smuggling, it's just overwhelming the resources on the border and throughout America. And so the reality is if you have a water leak in your house, the plumber comes, he shuts the main valve down. We have a fentanyl disaster in America, flooding the streets. We got to shut down the valve in Mexico. How do we do it? The best and brightest patriots in America, like some congressmen have already said, and offer support to the Mexican government to use technology to destroy these chemical production labs. Then we will see a disruption in the supply to this country. The frustration is that law enforcement is out there putting their lives on the line. They don't get the proper support. But more importantly is that it's just getting worse because the cartels are operating with impunity, working with China that wants to destroy America forever.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield the remaining balance of my time to you, sir.
Thank you. So some of the things that have been talked about today make me think of deterrence. What deters someone from taking a drug that's been laced with fentanyl, and what deters someone from producing and distributing fentanyl into this country? And Mr. Maltz, some people have said today, this was an early talker, cannot incarcerate our way out of this. And then they said, but we need to have tough penalties, including incarceration for those who deal the drugs. Is that a tacit admission that there is a way to deter dealers, and that would include sentencing to incarceration?
Absolutely. You want to put these people in jail for the longest amount of time that are killing our kids. We're not talking about putting couriers that are just moving product. They don't even know what they're moving. You have to deal with each case separately. But for the organization that is destroying our country, they have to feel the pain. Now, I will tell you this. You asked a question about the frustration. Right now, we have hundreds lined up in Mexico for extradition. The administrator of DEA testified. We can't get them out. We want to hold them responsible for what they're doing. That's going to be a deterrent. We saw that in Colombia for years when we went after the North Valle cartel, the Medellin cartel, and everyone. So we have to have these strong punishments.
Thanks, Mr. Maltz. And now recognize Ms. Lee from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. Today's hearing has allowed us all an opportunity to see how the crisis of fentanyl is affecting every community in America. In my own community in Florida, authorities seized more than 11 pounds of fentanyl, and this amount alone was enough to kill 2.7 million people. Agent Maltz, I'd like to return to your testimony. As a former federal prosecutor, I recognize the critical work that DEA agents are doing every day across America to fight the cartels and to keep America safe. One thing, a distinction that you've made here today that I think is important, I'd like for you to share with us a bit about how this problem has grown in its scope and the difference between organized crime and what you would categorize as narco-terrorists. Tell us, what is a narco-terrorist and what has led you to that conclusion?
Great question. I really appreciate that because I lived this nightmare for many years, over 10 years. When I was the head of the Special Operations Division, I wasn't reading in the local newspapers. I was living it with my counterparts around the world. And so China started the synthetic bombing campaign around 2008, 2009 with K2 spice and bath salts. Please go read about it. You'll see all the catastrophes in the country from those synthetic drugs. Then around 2012, they started with the fentanyl analogs in the mail services through the internet websites. Then they started sending pure fentanyl to Mexico. They also started, of course, for years, they've been sending precursor chemicals to make methamphetamine. That's why we have tons of methamphetamine in the country. We didn't even talk about that today. That's another whole hearing. Now, in Mexico, they're using all of that money, they're building up capabilities. They're buying weapon systems. They're dropping C4 explosives on their adversaries. I went down to the border, and there were 9,000 drones coming into America surveilling our brave men and women in Border Patrol. This is unacceptable. We're at war with the cartels, but we're still treating it like they're drug traffickers. They're not drug cartels. Please stop saying drug cartels. They're narco-terrorists like we've never seen. They run the country in Mexico. They intimidate. They corrupt. They are slaughtering people, chopping off heads, dismembering bodies, and they have arsenals. They have weapons that we don't even have, in certain countries around the world. So they have evolved. Everything's evolving. And the problem is the government is still using old talking points. This is not grandpa's opioid crisis. Okay, the pills, that's years ago. Yes, kids got addicted because of Big Pharma. Somebody said that. And Big Pharma never got held accountable because it's all about the money. Now, the cartels and China are the focus of our problem, so we need to deal with them.
So, Agent Maltz, in light of that changing landscape, in light of the escalation of the severity of this type of organization, how does that change what you need and what we should be doing here in Congress to equip DEA and your law enforcement partners to fight this fight?
DEA needs resources, but so does all the agencies as far as manpower. You know why? A lot of them are quitting. They're running away. They're getting jobs in the private sector because they're sick and tired of lack of action. And the boss of the DEA right now, she's running around with a one pill can kill campaign, spreading awareness like we've never seen. I go back to this committee can ask the Department of Education, what are they doing? And why is CDC not putting out timely and accurate stats on the greatest crisis to the history of this country? What's the answer to that? Because as a taxpayer, I'd like to see the CDC director, because she's already fell on the sword on the lack of reporting on COVID and the inaccuracies. How's that acceptable with all the technology we have? There's no consistency across the country. The guy in Kings County, Washington, talked about no cooler space. They're not trained. They don't have the technologies. So there's a lot of accountability that needs to be brought to the table in this town. But the DEA, they're going to continue to fight, just like Homeland Security, the FBI, ATF, the Marshals, because they get paid to save lives. The problem is it's much bigger than DEA and the law enforcement now. That's why we need to consider other options with the great patriots that work behind the scenes that could do some real good devastation. They could decimate the production labs. Why is that a bad thing? Decimate chemical production labs. And I wish there were more people over here that would listen to this, but they're not interested. They're out there doing something else. I don't know what's more important than the death of our kids.
Agent Maltz, another question. Can you tell us what it means when a substance is classified as Schedule I, Schedule II? How is that important, and what would it mean to you all in terms of the work that you're doing to try to combat this problem?
Well, a third grader can understand that you don't want to put deadly substances on the street. You want to at least categorize them as Schedule I drugs. Fentanyl, the pharmaceutical grade fentanyl, is a Schedule II and needs to remain a Schedule II. But the illicit fentanyl substances that are out there, it's like whack-a-mole. The DEA and all the agencies, they can't keep up with the way these guys are changing the different chemical compounds. And it's like, it's just so common. You just need common sense to understand that argument. They're killing our kids. We need to classify fentanyl-related substances as Schedule I. That's not going to solve this problem, but it's something that will help.
Thank you, Agent Maltz. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. And I yield 5 minutes to myself. I appreciate all of you being here and telling your story and also bringing different perspectives on this very, very critical, I view it as a national security and national health issue. When we look at this, we had several of my colleagues across the aisle talk about they gave $60 million here and $70 million there. When I go to the border and talk to Border Patrol agents who are so concerned about this problem, they say, we don't need more money. We need to be able to enforce the law. We are being denied the capacity to enforce the law. And that includes and is because they're being overrun. So we will go, there are whole shifts where the entire CBP agency that's supposed to be watching our border are actually working as processors at a detention facility where they won't be detained. Dr. Singer, they're not getting detained. they're being transported to wherever they want to be in the country, to the tune of over 5 million encounters, millions over the last 2 years. And then you have over 1 million, about 1.2 million known gotaways between the ports of entry. And anybody who watches will tell you it's at least 1-to-1 on the unknown gotaways. And when we showed you the video earlier today, these are young men and women dressed in camo. They don't want to be caught. They're transporting this drug across the border. And it comes up, I can tell you where it comes up from the Tohono O'odham, across the Tohono O'odham Reservation, goes out to I-8. There's loadout places there, and then from your crows fly about 30 miles from south of Phoenix. From there, it's going throughout the country. And it's finding its way into the hands of college students who really, they don't know anything about fentanyl because it's not been made a big deal. We know about it because we talk about it. So when I hear people say 90% of it is interdicted through the port of entry, no, 90% of what you catch may be in the port of entry. Of course, that data is old and out of touch. But it's coming through between the ports of entry and being disseminated widely in this country. Now, we have very little deterrence because I'm going to tell you that if these people are caught, they're caught in the Tucson sector, and they have a backpack of fentanyl, all they have to do is take that backpack off and walk a step away, and the deputy attorney general there, the U.S. attorney there, is not going to prosecute that case. There is no deterrence whatsoever. Why are they not going to? They're going to say we need, for instance, if it's marijuana, they say we have to have 400 pounds of marijuana on the person. Well, nobody can carry 400 pounds of marijuana. Same thing goes with fentanyl. Most of it's now coming in pills. It's coming in pill form because Americans want pills, and they're pressing them down south of the border, and they're disguised as pain medication, Percocet, Perc 30, whatever it is. So that's the reality of what's happening. And I appreciate, Dr. Singer, you said we want to make the black market less dangerous. But one way you make this less dangerous for the black market is to make it more dangerous for the people who are producing and distributing this drug. And so you may not be able to incarcerate yourself your way out of this, but you better do something to either destroy the facilities, destroy the economic capacity of this group, or they're going to keep going. And I'll just tell you that right now it's a multi-billion-dollar per month industry. And we need to call them what it is. They're terrorists. We need to declare them terrorists so we can get at their money stream, because if we can get at their money stream, we will impede them and we will slow this down. That's some of what needs to happen here. As we wrap up this hearing, I hope that across the aisle, we have found some comity on where we can go to start interdicting this horrific problem. That has to happen. And I just, again, thank you, our witnesses, for being here today. And you have some documents you want to put in? Please.
Before you have your concluding.
Well, she wants to, not for concluding remarks, but I'll recognize you for putting documents into the record.
Great. And if I might, Mr. Chairman, just make 1 or 2 points to answer you, which is, that is the direction of the legislation that I hope you will look at, that enhances and responds to the manufacturers and the distributors. Obviously, our jurisdiction is here in the United States, and enhanced penalties, and for those who wind up killing people because of the drug use. Their actions wind up killing people. I just want to conclude on Mr. Maltz, your patriotism and your enthusiasm. I work with DA agents all the time. Those based in Houston know their work, as I do the FBI, the ATF. So let me just say that you have been heard loudly and clearly. Mrs. Rockwell, her husband, have been heard very loudly and clearly. And so legislation that I hope the chairman will look at answers all these questions, particularly your outreach, your focus major campaign, your social media, the megaphone. You want the megaphone while you're doing your work, you want the megaphone. And I do know that the DEA does some very dangerous work, particularly those who are undercover. And we want to appreciate them as well. Dr. Singer, we need your voice, and we thank you for that. We thank Dr. Westlake for being here as well. So I hope the chairman and I will have an opportunity to engage, and I want to put into the record, as unanimous consent, a letter from the Law Enforcement Action Partnership signed by a coalition of current and former law enforcement officers, judges, and public safety professionals. The statement of Jason Pye, Director, Rule of Law Initiative, Due Process Institute. A letter from Jillian E. Snyder, Policy Director of Criminal Justice and Civil Liberties at the R Street Institute. A letter from Mazen Salah, Policy Director of Integrated Harm Reduction at the R Street Institute. And number 5, a letter from a coalition of organizations in support of the TEST Act. And I want to thank Mr. Cohen, Ms. McBath, and Ms. Dean for their presence here today. Ask unanimous consent to place these in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, and again, thanks to all the members who attended, thanks to those in the audience who came, and appreciate each one of you again on the panel. You were heard, you're important, and we're going to now thank you by adjourning. We're adjourned.